everyone, Maria. Welcome back. In the first part of our conversation, we talked about the ways we can support our immigrant students, and we dug deep into many of the structural supports that can be implemented to better address their specific needs, specifically as it comes to immigration status and the immigration journeys that may impact their educational outcomes. So I'd now like to move into the second part of our conversation where we will focus on multilingual and multicultural educators. One of the challenges we know exists throughout the country is the issue of recruiting qualified teachers to serve our multilingual and emergent bilingual immigrant students. Data from the Department of Education shows that 31 states and the District of Columbia are facing these challenges. And then bilingual educators are charged with the additional unseen linguistic labor that could affect their retention. These shortages are all occurring as the L population is growing throughout every state and accounts for 10% of our students nationally. So, Tom, I know that you have encountered this concern in your role at Oakland Unified. And I'm wondering, what has been the district's approach to recruitment?
Gosh, I mean, I think there's a lot of initiatives underway. We share the vision of having, a teaching staff that really represents the background of our students. And so, I think the approach that I think will take us the closest to that involves cultivating a pipeline basically beginning in high school and really trying to facilitate pathways for students who have been within our system, especially those who had an immigrant experience, attended our schools, then to return in the classroom. And, it's complicated because, of course, people have to go to college to become a teacher, and then they kind of leave our world. And so we're fortunate that a lot of people stay connected. And so we've focused on how do we create entry-level positions that could be accessible to somebody right out of college that might not be a teacher position, but could be a position that they could hold and be employed while also obtaining a teaching credential. So, one that I'm most excited about that has been underway for the last 3 years, led by some of my colleagues, it has involved just that. We have the paraprofessional job classification is called newcomer assistant, and they support teachers of, recently arrived immigrant students. And it's a full-time job with benefits. It does require a bachelor's degree, which is an impediment for some of the people we'd love to work with. But we've been able to employ people in that position and then use grant funds to basically pay for their teacher credentialing as a cohort. And so not only are we, most people, once upon a time, I guess people could go get a teaching credential without a job. I don't know how that works. So most people need a job while they're getting their credential. And, that's definitely true of the community of people that I'm referring to. And so people are employed, and then their teacher credentialing, because of this grant, is done as a cohort. So they're not just getting any credential, but they're working together as a cohort of people who are focused on serving English learners. And so while this cohort has not exclusively been people who have a kind of newcomer experience themselves, they have been prioritized. And it has been one of the ways that we have been able to get more people with this lived experience, as well as the just linguistic assets and disposition, all the things into the classroom. And so it's been exciting. In the last couple of years, I've been, kind of connected to it long enough to see some people actually, get their own classroom and become the teacher of record and really dig into this important work. And, the principal in me and the teacher in me, actually the teacher in me wishes I had 2 years as a paraprofessional in the classroom before I had gone in the classroom. I don't know what I was thinking in hindsight, like just going in the classroom with no experience. So not only is the credentialing that people receive contextualized to how do we support recent immigrant students in the classroom, but the work experience at the same time is helping people understand how our schools work, what are the dynamics in the classroom, and really positioning them in a better way to be effective more quickly, because of course we all know it takes time to really develop one's capacity as a teacher. So that's the example that I'm most excited about. You know, there have been other initiatives to really build community of teacher by kind of affinity groups of existing staff. So there's a program called Maestros or Maestras in the district, which is really to bring together Latinx educators, both to be in community with each other, so to reduce any kind of sense of isolation, but also to support recruitment efforts to bring other people into the district. And so those efforts, you know, I think are ongoing, and are valuable. But I am particularly excited about employment pipelines where people can, you know, sustain employment while preparing to be teachers.
Love hearing that, especially the idea of you're getting experience before you step in and are owning the classroom on your own, because that struggle of initially stepping into the classroom is real. And, you know, to the question of cultivating teacher pipelines, Denise, I'm going to turn to you. You and I both entered the classroom because of DACA. We taught very different populations. You supporting high school students with IEPs. I supported elementary multilingual learners with beginning and intermediate proficiency. And frankly, had it not been for this temporary and honestly insufficient protection for us and 2-year work permit for us, we may have never made our way into the classroom. And we are far from the only ones. There are an estimated 15,000 educators throughout the United States who depend on DACA to be able to continue their career in education. And there have been some really challenging developments over the past few weeks that further put a spotlight on that systemic barrier that exists for immigrant educators, specifically educators who may have grown up in the country and be very familiar with the education system, but they lack the work authorization to be able to step in. So I'm wondering if you could talk about the challenges currently facing undocumented educators and undocumented youth who may imagine themselves pursuing a career in education.
Yes, so DACA stands for Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And just for everyone's knowledge in the room, it is a 2-year executive order, which means it's not permanent. Any administration can come in and remove this order completely, even though they will probably not be able to without substantial community organizing pressure. So because of deferred action, a lot of educators were able to go into the classroom because you do need work authorization to be employed by the district or to be employed by a school network. And I know for me, like having been having graduated from college, I knew that I wanted to be a teacher and I wasn't sure how. So I remember going to a recruiter event with many teaching programs. And the first thing I'll ask them is, do you accept individuals with work authorization from DACA? And some organizations actually said, no, we only accept citizens or permanent residents. And I ended up choosing Teach for America because they were one of the few organizations at the time to allow educators with work authorization to enter the classroom and to support them along the way. And I was able to finish my core commitment of 2 years with Teach for America, and then I ended up staying for 3 more years. And so I think just number one, right, like these teaching programs need to be cognizant of educators who have DACA status who want to be in the classroom, because that's like the first barrier that I encountered. And then I think the second barrier relating to immigration status is the very specific experience of having your work authorization expire while you're in the classroom. So because USCIS, the government office, is the one dealing with all of these applications. They also need time, right? And I know that around March, we experienced a huge backlog of applications, which does affect everyday lives. If a teacher is in the classroom and their DACA/work authorization expires, then they can no longer remain in the classroom. And there have been other ways that I've heard districts go around this, right? So one way I know is that a credentialed teacher needs to be in the classroom. But if you're the credentialed teacher already and there's another credentialed teacher, it's very confusing, right? Like students are wondering, like, why are there two teachers in the classroom? And then another scenario is that teacher who, through no fault of their own, right, like has to wait for their work authorization, they can stay in the classroom and work for free until their work authorization comes in, because again, that piece of paper is required for employment. And so all of these scenarios are not great. We know that there's a big need for educators in the classroom, and educators with this specific lived experience of being undocumented and being immigrants, they bring so much to the lives of their students. And it's really a shame that they have to go through all of this, like that we have to go through all of this just to be in the classroom when we know that there's a teacher shortage.
Such a powerful point, Denise. And, I'm thinking back to Tom's point around we've got to start teacher pipelines in high school. And I'm thinking about our undocumented youth population currently in high school after the Hainan decision on DACA, which basically took away the opportunity for them to apply for DACA. They were never eligible to apply, youth who are between the ages of 15 and 18 because of the rescindance of DACA in 2017. And now, because of this court decision in Texas, they're never going to be eligible for that temporary benefit. So Denise, back to you. I know that you are tapped into powerful advocacy efforts. You've recently spoken with U.S. Department of Education Secretary Miguel Cardona, along with other immigrant educators, documented educators specifically. And I'm wondering, what is the ask that's being made of him, and what are immigrant rights advocates working towards right now to ensure structural solutions, not just for the documented educators currently in the classroom, but this coming cohort of students who could potentially contribute to the teacher shortage?
Yes, so the conversation with the Department of Education Secretary really focused on two legislations. So the first legislation is the Dream and Promise Act. And the Dream and Promise Act is a permanent pathway to citizenship for our dreamers, right? And dreamers, there are many definitions out there, but young undocumented individuals who meet certain criteria will become eligible to pursue this pathway to citizenship, because right now there isn't a pathway. The second piece of legislation is the Farm Worker Modernization Act, and this bill will include our farm workers and other essential workers who have done so much during the pandemic, to keep us afloat as a society. So providing the food on our table, providing the necessary care in very, very dangerous and very risky environments such as hospitals, right? So these two pieces of legislation really speak to the impermanence of DACA, because DACA is, again, like I mentioned, it's every 2 years, it's an executive action, and any administration can take it away. We have seen a back and forth with the Supreme Court as well, where every 2 years it gets contested based on its legality. And for our immigrant populations, they cannot live in this uncertainty. They cannot live in this fear. They also need not just a permanent pathway, but they need assurance that they can live their lives and not be separated from their families and not be separated from the only place that they call home. So with that conversation, again, we are thinking long-term here. We're thinking, how can we, yes, DACA is great, but how can we fight for something that will be here to stay?
Thanks for that. And I'm just wondering, do you have any thoughts on how the education system can support those advocacy efforts?
That's a great question. I think that there's really three levels, right? There's the local, the state, and the national. And right now we're talking about a national legislation that will affect everybody. If as an educator, you know, Maria works in the classroom every day. So all the little things that educators can do to make sure that their students feel loved and supported, regardless of immigration status. I think that that goes a long way. And then I think for advocacy efforts, continuing to think of policies and big picture support systems, as Tom was saying, right, to make sure that our newcomer students don't fall through the cracks, that we're really tracking their progress. And then in the national level, making sure that our efforts are concentrated into really pushing for these legislation bills to pass, because we have been fighting for the citizenship battle for a very long time. And for some of us, we cannot wait. We cannot wait until more students fall out of status and until they become so desperate that they leave or we never hear from them again. So I think it really is a three-part effort, right? Three-level effort, local, state, and national. But also beyond that, all of the grassroots efforts are really pushing for something bigger in the movement.
If I could, sort of build on what you were saying, I feel like when I was talking earlier about this pipeline and around people needing to go to college, well, I think that there's a lot that we can do as a system to make sure that the way that we're supporting students in that transition to college is considerate of people who lack documentation, right? So like there's so many ways to still enter the system and graduate from college, but there are like extra hoops and extra steps. And so, there are lots of people in the high school space whose job it is to prepare students for college, to support their application process, the financial aid. And one of the more recent things we have going on here, which I'm hopeful about, is liaisons that actually follow students, like short-term case management from the sort of last few months of high school into the first few months of community college, because many students enroll but then don't persist. And often sometimes it's more like logistical bureaucratic issues than actual like being ready to do the learning. And often those logistical bureaucratic hurdles are intertwined with, what people's status is legally in terms of how they're documented or not. And so if we as a system can prepare the adults who are responsible for those post-secondary transitions to make sure that all of those supports are considerate of the needs of undocumented people, then I think we're going to do a better job. We'll have more people qualified to become teachers on the other end. But I also agree with Denise. We need a national policy change 10 years ago, 20 years ago. It's already too late, but it still needs to happen.
Building upon what was just said, in regards to like creating pipelines and making sure people and students have access to be able to attain higher education, it's also really important that students are aware of the resources that currently exist. But in order for that to happen, educators and those in leadership positions need to make sure to share that information and not necessarily wait for a student to be like, oh, I'm undocumented, or like I have DACA, what resources are there for me? Because that's a sensitive topic for a lot of students. So it's important for administrators to make sure that they're promoting in their, for example, in California, right? They're promoting the California Dream Act application, and not just when it's time to apply for financial aid, FAFSA. It's like, oh, FAFSA and the California Dream Act, and making sure that they're sharing that, like, oh, well, actually, for individuals that are US citizens that qualify for FAFSA and others that qualify for FAFSA, if you miss the March 2nd deadline, there are other deadlines for you that you can still be able to get financial aid. Versus the California Dream Act, if you miss that March 2nd deadline, it's a bigger deal for you. But again, it's also making sure that even the college counselors are aware of these resources in order for them to be able to share with their students. Sometimes unfortunately, college advisors aren't even aware of the resources that exist. It adds to their plate of work because they already have a lot of work on their plates, but it's also potentially ideally, because we're dreaming, right, of what we would like, what we envision, making sure that there's an actual contact in these colleges that you're directing them to, rather than like, oh, well, you're no longer my responsibility. Good luck when you get to CSUN, or good luck when you get to your college. Because sometimes these colleges do have resources, but again, having to out themselves, having to go out of their way to advocate for themselves adds a lot of responsibility to the student, when it should be, in my opinion, educators' responsibility to let them know of the resources that are available, because a lot of these students are also first-generation college students, right? So they're also learning the whole hidden curriculum of higher education on top of learning how to navigate entering the workforce, on top of all these other factors that come with being a first-gen college student. There's just a lot there that needs to be unpacked, and it sounds like students need to be like I've heard, well, we shouldn't be hand holding students because they're adults. They should be able to research and figure it out, have been things I've heard in the past. So to touch on that, I also think of like the counter narrative to that is, all these resources exist. Don't we want to use the resources that are available in order to then provide more resources to students? Because understanding the logistical perspective of institutions, we're not able to get funding for resources unless we demonstrate that there is a need. And sometimes there is a need, but students aren't asking because they don't know what to ask, right? You don't know what you don't know. So it's important to be vocal about what exists. That way, when students are advocating for more, they're like, oh, we appreciate that we have X, but we still need Y and Z, versus them asking for X and then be like, oh, actually, your institution already offers that. You just didn't know.
I so appreciate you all really getting into the nuance there, right? It's not just about understanding the systemic barriers that exist and working towards changing them. It's also about building the ability to navigate systems that were not necessarily built for these students and that are currently excluding them. We can and we must address that. Before I close out, Maria, I wanted to just ask you, because you are currently in the classroom very early in your career, about to go into your second year or first year 2.0. What's it going to take to keep an educator like you in the classroom?
The same way that we ask teachers to see students holistically, it's important that our administrators see us as teachers holistically as well. Sometimes, and it's understandable, right, especially in the middle of a pandemic, that there was a bigger demand on our plate of the things that we needed to do. And I think it's important, again, going back to what we asked of students, of making sure that we have clear expectations, what we want from our students. I think it's important to have a team that has clear expectations for me. So I know when I'm falling short as an educator, but I also know when I'm thriving. I see my role as a teacher also as a student, because I'm new in my professional experience. So I'm learning as I'm also teaching, but I'm learning my role now as an educator. And I think it's important for me to have administrators and just an overall team that remembers what it's like to be beginning in their career, and remembering to have grace when one makes mistakes. But again, going back to what I said before, being very clear of the expectations and being very clear of what is wanted for me in order for me to be able to thrive in those settings and be able to create an environment where I'm not scared to ask for help, where I know what resources exist for me. And going back to being seen as a holistic individual, understanding clear work boundaries of after X amount of time, like I'm actually done because I have a family, I have friends, I have a life outside of teaching as well. And I think this isn't necessarily unique to me, but it's a conversation that's been going around through several years, right? The idea that educators are underpaid, that's a conversation that sometimes we need to unpack, right? Do we decide, let me pause there. We need to, sometimes we have inner turmoils of deciding, doing work that matters, right? Because we care about this work, but also having financial stability, right? The same way that students can't thrive as students when they're worrying about being able to have food on the table, that's a very real thing for several educators as well, especially for educators that are starting off their career who still aren't making a lot in that salary scale. On top of that, it's really important for me as a teacher to feel valued, that my opinion matters, that even though I have a lot of learning to do for my veteran teachers and administration, but feeling that I carry experiences, that I carry certain techniques that can be of an asset to my institution is very important at my school site. Feeling that I have a voice and not just a simple like, oh, let me hear you, but also actually like, let me implement what you've said. Like, let me actually take some tangible actions based on what you said. Or it's like, actually, I appreciate your opinion, but this is why we can't implement it in X, Y, and Z, right? Because it's a conversation. Those are the three main things that I feel that I need: a safe space, feeling heard, and actual transparency from those in leadership at my school site.
Love that. Thank you so much for that response. And Tom, I'm hoping that you took notes over there because you're supporting these people who are stepping into the classroom. So just to close out, let's return to a broad focus on immigrant students. And we've already touched on it in some ways, right? But how can students be included in the solutions that our education systems need? Tom, you specifically talked about this already, but wondering if there's anything else that you all want to add, specifically, thinking about how do we get them interested in pursuing a career in education?
I'm thinking about some of the asset-based questions we were discussing earlier. We name linguistic assets as something many immigrant students and families bring with us, and more than one of our high schools now, because in Oakland, Mum, which is a Mayan language, is very common and is a challenge for us as a system because we do not have many staff members that can speak this language, although it gets better every year. And many schools have actually, in coordination with their work-based learning, linked learning approaches, have created translation and interpretation programs within the school, because in real life, there are needs for medical and court interpretation, especially for languages that are less common. But also, within the school. And what happens for many of these students is that they end up really working closely with their peers who have had less time in the system, and in a way that validates their strengths and is actually preparing them for the workplace, but also exposes them to these opportunities to support the learning of other people. And so I think that that's like one little slice, certainly not like a broad systems level thing, but it didn't start out with the idea that, oh, this could be a teacher pipeline, but it has become clear that there are many students who find a lot of joy in that kind of learning space, especially when they're working with younger students. And I think that the other thing I said in the course of that is that if we think about the Mum community, which is quite large in Oakland, each year there are more and more members of that community employed in our schools. And I think the more, it's sort of like a cyclical thing, right? Like the more that our schools, the people in the schools represent the community that we serve, I think the more likely we are to see our students see themselves as the teachers in the future. So I know that's like a chicken egg thing, but I still think it's true. And my hope is that as we take any opportunity we have to make that representation real, that in time we will see an acceleration of the of teachers who come from the same communities as our students.
I want to add to that students know what they need, whether or not they still know how to vocalize it or not. And it's important that schools actually reach out to them and ask them, like, what do you need from us, rather than just making the assumption of what students need. But in order for that to happen, again, going back, having a safe environment and making sure that students feel comfortable having that dialogue and interaction. I know for my school site, we were called a school-based management school, where the idea is that multiple stakeholders get to be part of the decision-making process. That includes students, teachers, administrators, parents. They all get to be a part of that conversation. However, there's a two-part to this, because although everybody in theory is invited, not everybody has the means to have this be an accessible space, right? So it tends to be that a certain population are the ones that are actually going out of their way to vocalize. So there's a misrepresentation of the parents and the students that are vocalizing their needs versus the parents that are being left out of the conversation. Not because they don't care, it's just because sometimes meetings are happening when they have to work, or for whatever reason, they're just not able to make it into these spaces in order for the conversation to happen. And so then that's where it becomes the school's responsibility to make sure that there's an actual representation of voices of the people that they're serving. But how does that happen? Then that becomes like Tom's responsibility of those who hold those positions to kind of figure out how that happens. And unfortunately, sometimes we're aware of the problem, but solving it is a whole other story. So sometimes it's easy for me to point out problems, but I also know in order for there to be solutions, there are definitely longer conversations that need to take place.
And just to consolidate like what I'm hearing from Tom and Maria, I think we need to believe in our student leaders as well. Maybe because I teach mostly high school, right? And I know that they're so capable, but even if middle school and elementary school, we have students who are student leaders, and they will tell you what they need, and they may not have the language for it, and they may not know the resources available, but they know what they need. And so I think like just really trusting that they like building that relationship so that they can get to the point where they can ask like their trusted adults, right? For us to be able to bridge that need, I think is really important in building their student leadership.
Love that. We're going to close there on let's trust our students and their capabilities fully and bring that into our education system. Thank you all so much for joining this Passing the Mic conversation. There is so much that was shared today that are just like gems of wisdom that I hope so many people get to listen in on and expand on. Because Maria, as you said, we can have these conversations, we can critique, but we need to get to the solutions, right? And that's going to take some deeper work. Appreciate you all so much. Seychelle, back to you.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Passing the Mic. We encourage you to keep the conversation going and share your thoughts with us on social media using the hashtag #PassingTheMic_TNTP. We look forward to connecting with you during our next conversation. Until then, stay safe.